Hello, this is Dr. Christopher Wilson again. This is the third section dealing with wisdom literature, and we're going to concentrate on the book of Proverbs, Psalms, and the Song of Solomon. There's a couple other books that I'll just very briefly describe. They're also considered wisdom literature. One would be the book of Job. The purpose of the book of Job is to test God's policies concerning justice. The conclusion is that God's justice cannot be assessed because we can never have enough information to assess it. Instead, his justice must be inferred from his wisdom. The book of Job obviously deals with suffering. Job was a loyal servant, and God allowed him to be attacked by the devil, because the devil thought that he could get him to curse God, but it never occurred. No matter how much calamity hit Job, he still loved God. Another book that I'm just briefly going to give an overview is Ecclesiastes. The purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes is to demonstrate that there is nothing in life that is able to bring self-fulfillment or give meaning to life. Frustration and troubles are unavoidable, and we should not expect answers to why things happen. Rather than pursuing self-fulfillment, we should enjoy the good things of life as a gift from God. We should recognize that troubles help to shape us as people. A God-centered approach to life accepts both success and adversity as coming from the hand of God. I'm only briefly going to talk about the book of Proverbs because you're probably fairly familiar with that. It's largely a book of wise sayings to help you prosper and to live a better life. The underlying theme is that fear of the Lord, that is, reverence and awe, is the basis of all wisdom. The next major text would be the book of Psalms. Most conservative scholars think that it was written by David. And there's various types of psalms within the text. Some say 4 different types, some say 7. We basically see David at different points having every human emotion. For instance, lament, which means sorrow, is the most common type of psalm. We see this in Psalm 90. I'll give you a quote from that. Psalm 90, verses 13 through 17. Relent, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Fill us at daybreak with your mercy, that all of our days we may sing for joy. Make us glad as many days as you humbled us. For as many years as we have seen trouble, show your deeds to your servants, your glory to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God be ours. There's also, of course, many psalms of praise. Probably the most famous one is Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. And then the psalms that are probably the most controversial are what are called imprecatory psalms. These are psalms where David is asking God to punish his enemies. And they're controversial to modern Christians because, again, many modern Christians have trouble reconciling the Old Testament with some of the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. For instance, loving your enemies. I'll give you a quote from Psalm 69, verses 23 to 29 to show you an instance of an imprecatory psalm. Here David says, "May their own table be a snare for them, and their communion offerings a trap. Make their eyes so dim they cannot see, keep their backs ever feeble. Pour out your wrath upon them. Let the fury of your anger overtake them. Make their camp desolate, with none to dwell in their tents. For they pursued the one you struck, added to the pain of the one you wounded. Heap punishment upon their punishment. Let them gain from you no vindication. May they be blotted from the book of life, not registered among the just." So in this and many other imprecatory psalms, we see David asking God to punish the enemies of Israel. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, the ancient Jews were God's chosen people, and they had enemies all around them, much like today. And so David is asking God to punish his enemies, basically to protect Israel. Some other imprecatory psalms are Psalm 55, 59, 69, 79, 109, and 137. And again, these are psalms that many modern pastors don't quote from because they have trouble explaining how all this is reconciled with many of the teachings in the New Testament. The next book that I'd like to address somewhat in depth is the Song of Solomon, which at least in America is the least quoted book of the Bible. It's extremely rare to have an American pastor give a sermon out of this. Many Christians just don't know what to do with it. It's largely a book of poetry. It's about love and sensuality within marriage, etc. Many conservative Christians go so far as to have an allegorical interpretation of the text, again, because they just don't know what to do with it for reasons I'll get to in a moment. In the allegorical interpretation, Israel is seen as the bride of God. So you simply substitute God for the groom and Israel for the bridegroom throughout the text, and you just come up with all these poetic, metaphorical meanings. But I don't think that's correct, and most conservative scholars, I think, still take a more literal view, that it's a song about marriage and love. It's a beautiful book about marriage and human sexuality. The reason I think it, and maybe it's different within Africa, but I think the reason that so many Christians have a problem with this is that America has what you call puritanical streaks still, where these kind of things are somehow considered dirty. Maybe you could trace some of this all the way back to Plato, Neoplatonism that was in the church for a while, that saw everything of the flesh as being evil, and everything that was of the spirit as being good. I'm not really certain, but I think that this is culturally specific, and I think it's specific to say conservative Protestantism in particular within the Western context. Modern America doesn't view sexuality and having children the way that it once did. It's become somewhat, I guess for lack of a better word, sterile. We have a negative population growth. Without immigration, the population would be going down year by year largely due to abortion. I believe there's about 1 million abortions a year, and also to contraception. And with contraception, many people don't know this, but a lot of the birth control pills that people take act as what's called a abortifacient, which means that they cause a fertilized egg to not embed within the uterus, thus causing an abortion. And so many people who don't know any better have actually had perhaps dozens, if not more, abortions throughout their life due to this. It's a culture of death. It's a culture that doesn't praise children, that doesn't praise fertility. And this is why I think the Song of Solomon is so important, that as difficult as it is, as pastors operating within America, it's important to understand the biblical view of marriage and procreation and everything else. I'll just give you a couple of brief statistics, particularly in view of pastors. The statistics are that half of all pastors, I believe within the last month, or maybe it's within the last 6 months, have viewed pornography. being a pastor, very often you have people within the congregation, women of the congregation, trying to lead you astray. It's almost somewhat like being a celebrity, let's say, the same way that an athlete has women coming to them all the time. Maybe it's probably not nearly as strong, but it does happen. So this is why it's important also for pastors to understand the proper role of sexuality, etc., within marriage, and to have a good and loving relationship with their wife. And I think that you'll see within the Song of Solomon that this is the model which God shows for us. I think that 90% of all problems within the American context for marriage could be solved by simply following two verses in the Bible. One is Ephesians 5:22 to 5:25, which deals with submission and the husband loving the wife. And the second one is 1 Corinthians 7, verses 4 and 5, which deals with the role sex is supposed to play within a marriage. Let me go ahead and first start with the Ephesians quote. Ephesians: Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church, and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of the body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So this is perhaps in America one of the more controversial texts, because it says that wives should be in submission to their husbands, but perhaps the greater burden is actually upon the husband, because the husband is supposed to love his wife as much as Christ loved the church. He's supposed to protect her and nourish her and love her as he loves himself. In fact, the implication is even more than he loves himself. He must sacrifice for her. So this is the model of how marriage is supposed to work. The second passage, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 4 and 5, says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife. Do not deprive one another except by mutual consent for a limited time, so you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you through your lack of self-control. So here again, we see that sex within marriage is natural. It's a beautiful thing. It's the means of procreation. It's a gift from God. And this is what we see throughout the Song of Solomon. As I said before, America has a negative population rate amongst indigenous Americans. Regular Americans that aren't immigrants. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest birth rate in the world. So clearly this value hasn't infected Africa yet. But you see this throughout the world. Where I'm staying currently in the Dominican Republic, the average birth rate per couple up until the 70s, I believe, was fairly similar. People used to have 7 kids, 8 kids. Now it's, I believe, around 3. It's very common to see women with 3 kids here. And of course, the ironic thing in America is that a lot of people only have one child, maybe two, and they say they can't afford it anymore. You know, America, the richest country in the world, and people can't afford children. But there is some truth to this, because things in America, you know, we have more wealth, but things are more expensive too. I know this myself. My kids, you know, living here in the Dominican Republic, they have American taste for food. So, you know, if I fed them rice, beans, and water, the way that the kids here grow up, they just don't want to eat it. They would all be very skinny. So unfortunately, they have American taste, and I have to, you know, pay the grocery bill for all that. But getting back to the Song of Solomon, I think it's a very important text for pastors to be familiar with, and I don't think that you have to go to the allegorical interpretation in order to preach out of it. I think that doing so robs God, you know, and robs the Bible of its meaning. God gave marriage and human sexuality and everything as a gift. And we see with Solomon later in his life, at one point he married many pagan women. I believe he had hundreds and hundreds of concubines. And we see that it was the pagan women that led him astray, led him to not be close with God, to worship other gods. So this is another importance within marriage. Perhaps, you know, one's wife has more effect on them than anyone else. So it's very important for pastors, in the first place, to marry the right woman, and then secondly, to have a good marriage. And I think that throughout the Song of Solomon, you see a lot of this beauty of how marriage and everything should function. So that's about all I have on these topics. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and email them to me. This is, you know, for the third section. We have one more about the background section, and I'll try to have that up within the next week or so. And I encourage all of you to, you know, get caught up on your papers, because we have a little bit over a month left in the